How very strange it is that the church year begins with this question. What would you do if you knew that the world was going to end tomorrow? In our gospel lesson, Jesus seems to be warning his disciples about the end of time, and it isn't pretty. Doom and gloom, falling stars, shaking heavens. Where's the hope? Which is the theme of our first Sunday in Advent. Do we really think this passage makes any sense today? Well, in some circles, of course, it does. I'm sure you all remember, it seems like every decade or so, someone comes out with this new idea about when the world's going to end. I remember a generation ago, it was Hal Lindsey's late great Planet Earth. And then, of course, remember the Y2K scare in the year when we turned over to the year 2000. A couple of years ago, all the attention was given to a guy named Harold Camping, who heavily promoted his predictions that Jesus would return on May 21st. And then, of course, when that didn't happen, he changed the date to October 21st. And then remember the whole whoop-de-doo, if you will, about the Mayan calendar ending. And, of course, the world was going to end when the Mayan calendar ended on December 21st, 2012. So many people have wrongly predicted the end of the world, and it has actually become a laughingstock in our day because, of course, Jesus says, no one knows the time. Not even him. And yet, all those folks predicting the end, they've got something right. It's not about the timing, of course, but what they have right is that one of the promises of Scripture is that Jesus the Christ will return and that God will bring the creation that God fashioned to a good end. And that everything we tend to think of as permanent is more fragile and more vulnerable than we like to imagine. And deep down, I suspect we all really know this. Whether it's watching the leaves fall in autumn or encountering the death of a dear friend, or an illness that took longer to recover from, or maybe the increasing warnings that we have about climate change and the destruction of our Earth's resources from irresponsible use, all of these things remind us of how fragile and impermanent our world and our lives really are. So what would you do if you knew that the world was going to end tomorrow? Would you reconcile with a lost friend or a family member? Would you finish a project that you had started years ago? Would you tell your children or your parents that you love them one more time? Would you wrap your beloved in a long, tender embrace? What would you do? Asking and answering this question can clarify our values, can't it? And also sharpen our priorities in our life. So it's not a bad question to ask as we race from Thanksgiving to Christmas. Why? Well, because it's so easy to get caught up in the pressures to have the perfect Christmas that we lose sense not only of what Christmas really means, but we actually lose ourselves in that whole rat race. Okay, I'm not building up here to rant about the true meaning of Christmas, and I'm also not interested in scolding you about getting caught up in the secular celebrations of the season. Instead, what I want to do for you is that amidst all your planning and preparing, all the parties and the cooking and the shopping and the cards, I want to offer you some space, some Advent space, to be still, to experience just a bit of quiet, and to remind you of who you are, God's beloved children. And here's where Mark's alarming passage has something hopeful to say. Because after all the predictions about the end, Jesus says no one knows the day or hour. So we have to keep close watch. He compares our situation to that of servants who don't know when their master will return and yet are still expected to prepare for it. So one way to read this parable is as a call to constant vigilance. And there's something to that. We're always called to be on the lookout for Christ in our world and in our lives, whether it's at the end of time or whether it's in the faces of our neighbors. But I think there's something else going on here in this text. Jesus says, we do not know whether the master will come in the evening or at midnight or at cockcrow or at dawn. Do these words sound familiar? Well, when Mark wrote them, he very much intended them to sound familiar. Notice Jesus' words about the end time come just prior to his passion. He's getting ready to head to Jerusalem here. And where else do you remember hearing these words? Of evening, midnight, cockcrow, and dawn. Well, they're in the events that lead right up to the crucifixion, right? First of all, Mark records that the Last Supper begins with, when it was evening, Jesus gathered his disciples together for that Last Supper. The second one was Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Mark says he came and found them sleeping. Why? Because it was the middle of the night. It was midnight. And third, Peter's denial of even knowing Jesus 3 times. And then what happened? The cock crowed. And then finally, Mark records the trial before Pilate, where we read, as soon as it was morning, dawn, the chief priests consulted with the elders and handed Jesus over to Pilate. Do you see what I mean? Another way to look at Jesus' words here about the end time is he's bringing them together with precisely the moment that he was nailed to the cross, and we see God's love poured out for us and for all the world in that crucifixion. So he's predicting the end of time with the same words that are recorded in the description of his last hours, to remind us that the end of time will be the same as it was at his crucifixion. It will be a time when God's love is poured out for the whole world. So it is not a time of doom and gloom and fear, but it is a time of hope, because God's love is all over it. All over it. Martin Luther, one time when he was asked what he would do if he believed that the world was ending tomorrow, said, I'd plant a tree today. And so we too, in order to be prepared, are called to do that same thing. To live our lives confident of God's love for us and sure of God's promises about the future. And so we can invest in today, in the present. We can invest in the everyday and the ordinary of our days. We can invest in the people and the causes around us, for we have God's promise in the cross and in the resurrection of Christ that in time, God will draw all of God's creation, not just to an end, but to a good end. So remember how you answered that question about what would you do if the world were to end tomorrow? Well, guess what? You don't need to wait. You can do those things right now. Love the ones you want to love. Finish the work you started. Be reconciled to those who need you. Be faithful to the people and the tasks around you. Undertake some small and wonderful yet great endeavor. Why not? For Christ has come. Christ is coming. And Christ will come again. And all in the name of love. And we, who are God's beloved children, for whom Christ died,